Hi, welcome to another episode of Hot Takes with me, the Silver Fox. There has, of course, been much wailing and gnashing of teeth in independent circles, particularly the SNP, over the decision by Rishi Sunak to hold the general election during Scottish school holidays. They were saying that it was against democracy, that so many people would lose their votes and be disenfranchised. And all this false greeting has been found to be, well, bluntly putting it, a load of old rubbish. It is not true. It is a lie. Analysis has shown that the result would have stood anyway. And indeed, in the only place where across the whole of Scotland it may have made some difference in some respect, a very small difference it must be said, the SNP actually managed to retain the seat anyway. And so for them it didn't make any difference. So why all the furore, other than the fact that they're just general mischief making? Well, let's have a look at this, because it is just typical of the SNP to always find excuses. They are saying that it was the summer holidays and the election during the summer holidays which cost them all those seats and made them lose the election. And we're going to put that myth to bed, because it is not the case. What actually happened is the good people of Scotland rejected the SNP and their 17 years of failure and said enough's enough. They want a change. They're fed up with the criminality, the corruption, the stupidity, the ineptitude, the failure, the just general malaise that's affected the whole nation after 17 years of concentrating on an independence dream which will never happen. Now, this is an article here. It's sort of claiming all these things, and it's saying that it was actually the BBC has done this analysis. This is in the BBC. This is from the Scottish Daily Express, but they are claiming it was a BBC analysis. Now, you can say what you like about the BBC in many respects, but I think in this one we can probably believe it, given how sort of pro-SNP, anti-Tory they are. They're not going to try and spin this as a good idea for the Tory party. So I suppose it does have that, at least that glaze of veracity as far as it goes, as far as it is a BBC analysis. But this claim they have that it was down to the summer holidays election is clearly wrong. Rishi Sunak called the election early. He thought the people coming across on the boats were going to increase. It would look bad. He thought that there was numbers in the Conservative Party writing to the 1922 committee to oust him, whereas if he called the election, that wouldn't happen. There was many reasons for it. Ironically, of course, his actual economic policy was just turning the corner, and we've seen 2 months now of low inflation and of actual growth. So there's an irony that the Labour government are going to inherit Rishi's good work. Anyway, analysis by BBC Scotland of voter turnout has suggested that the actual numbers would have made very little difference in terms of postal votes. Almost a quarter, or 24% of Scots, applied for postal voting. Almost 1 million people, with the figure varying throughout the country, from Edinburgh West, where a third of the people voted by post, and Coatbridge and Bellshill, where the figure was just 16. So a quarter of people in Scotland voted by post regardless. Now, a quarter of the Scotland weren't on holiday. They didn't leave the country. They just liked the idea of postal voting for some weird reason. You vote by post and then something happens and you can't change it. Sucks, doesn't it? Anyway, the Beeb used the example of Glasgow, where 73.5%, which was down from 76.5% in 2019, of those registered for postal voting actually returned their ballot. So, within a very tiny degree. However, the number of people voting by post in Glasgow is below a fifth. And that means that even in the drop in turnout could not be attributed to the holidays. And it would still not have been enough to wipe out the SNP in the city. Their analysis shows it. Scotland did not go on holiday and forget to vote SNP. They literally did not vote SNP. It was put through. The vast majority of postal votes were counted, and within the frame of reference, it was enough to oust the SNP. even those who didn't return their votes, even if they were all counted as SNP votes, it would still not have been enough to return any more seats. And they say the only seat that that would have done would have been Dumfries and Galloway, ironically. Voter turnout among the postal voters was down 5% over 1,000 votes, which could have made a difference, with the Tories edging out the SNP by 930 votes, but they didn't. And so it was still there. So there you go. All this whining, moaning, complaining about postal votes that the SNP themselves like to push. And they're saying, but now it's come back and bite us. Look, And they're making these excuses that it was all these Scots taking their kids away and being in Mallorca or wherever. Load of old pish. What actually happened was the people of Scotland looked around. They opened their eyes. The scales fell from the eyes. And they had this Damascene conversion. And they saw Scotland for what it was after 17 years of SNP rule. And they said, enough. No more. No further. It is absolutely superb. You know that they're all going to complain that the BBC now... Whoops, hit the thing. You all know that the BBC... so they're all going to complain that the BBC is now biased, which is clearly rot. If there is any bias, it's pro-SNP, anti-Tory bias. So they've got that. They've got no one to blame but themselves. And it's marvellous to see. So they can sit there, and like I say, they can grind their teeth, and there will be much wailing. But deep at the heart, at the very head of the SNP, they will now know that the problem isn't postal voting. And it never was. And when Swinney, who asked for this big post-mortem investigation and wanted to find out why people didn't vote the SNP, he could try asking them. He could go out there onto the streets and say, why didn't you vote SNP? But this time, actually listen to the answers and address the issue and stop trying to push an unpopular, unwanted obsession with independence and start doing the actual day job, what they wanted. Had they done that for 17 years, Scotland could be in a much, much better position. And indeed, had Scotland been run properly for 17 years, had the SNP pushed and made Scotland wonderful and brilliant and fantastic and viable, they would probably have won the 2014 referendum. They'd have said, look how good we've made Scotland with the limited powers we have. Now let's take it to the next level. They would have won. But instead they destroyed Scotland and said, let's blame Westminster. And that's why they've lost. Because people know, ultimately, it ain't Westminster. Thanks very much for listening. Take care. Goodbye.